Namaste and welcome back to the MOOC certificate course on quantitative and mixed methods research. We are in the third session of week 7 and I will continue from where I had stopped in the second session. So in the second session we had introduced the concept of case studies as a possible potential avenue to analyze qualitative data. So today I will try to complete in this video the basic tenets of what we mean by case study research in qualitative data analysis. Now if we look at this framework which is in front of us, this was developed by Robert in 2003 and the total and the complete reference would be provided to you in this supplement. For all those learners who are interested to take case study research further in qualitative research, I would suggest that you read this book by Robert in, because he is considered to be the founding father of explaining how to get started with case study research. Now this framework in a nutshell will tell you what is meant by defining and designing case studies, preparing, collecting and analyzing data for case studies, and how would you reach closure in a case study. Now in the previous session, that is session number 2 in week 7, I had concluded with the idea of replication logic vis-a-vis sampling logic in case studies. Now we need to understand the difference between the two, and that will tell you how you would select your cases. Now I am emphasizing on this time and again because this will also tell you the difference between how we collect data for a survey vis-a-vis how we collect data in a typical case study research, which is a prominent method of doing qualitative studies. Now when you look at sampling logic, the idea is to collect more and more number of instances of respondents who have experienced or not experienced a particular phenomena. So the emphasis is always on the breadth, that how many people have been able to experience a particular phenomena. So that is called as a sampling logic, and sampling logic will also tell you that you need to get your sample pre-decided prior to getting started with your research. But replication logic follows a completely different set of philosophy altogether. Now in case studies, when we select a case, we treat every case as an experiment. So typically, if I look at an experiment, whether it is done in a laboratory or whether it is done in a quasi-laboratory situation. Quasi-laboratory situation means a situation where you will not completely create a proper lab, but you will undertake the experimental research design by simulating the conditions of a lab. So that is the reason why we call it a quasi-lab. Now whether we look at a quasi-lab or a real lab, the funda of experiments is that you replicate the experiment time and time over again to understand the causal linkages that you are trying to prove. So simply put, if I take the example of some of the classic experiments which have been done in the area of management or even in the area of classic sciences, let us take the example of the Pavlovian experiments. Pavlovian experiments were a classic experiment in the domain of psychology, and they were borrowed into the domain of management into many areas of application, including marketing. So the basic idea of the Pavlovian experiment was to connect a simulated or a stimulated response with a stimulus that has got no connection with the response altogether. So with a series, with a chain of experiments, replicating the same experiments under different situation, he was able to prove that a completely unrelated stimulus can also evince a response which is expected. So typically, if I look at a case study, when we are looking at the chain of events that are unfolding in a case study, the idea behind a case is the same as the idea behind the experiment, that you need to replicate the case study time and again in different contexts in order to prove the causal linkages that you are trying to prove. So once again I go back to the Pavlovian experiment so that people understand what I am trying to explain by the replication logic. Now, in the Pavlovian experiments, the idea was that when you have an unconditional stimulus, you would have an unconditional response. So, in taking a dog for an experiment, when you place a platter of food in front of the dog would salivate. So, the salivation was a unconditioned response to a unconditioned stimulus. Now, the next set of experiments were conducted in a slightly different setting. So, what was that different setting? That when the platter of food is placed, prior to placing the platter of food, a bell is rung. But then when this was done for the first time, the dog was not able to associate the bell with the food. So, there was no response in the dog when the bell was rung, but gradually when this chain was repeated over and over again, it was seen that when the bell was rung, then there was the salivation from the dog. So, this was a conditioned stimulus evicting or evincing a conditioned response. So, what was happening here is that you don't go and find out that how many dogs would salivate when a platter of food is placed in front of them, but what are you doing? With that single case, you are repeating the chain time and again in slightly different circumstances to understand what is the causal linkage between the phenomena that you are trying to understand. Similar is the case of a case study. So, in the previous session when I had spoken of replication, I had taken an initial proposition, and what was the proposition? The proposition stated that if for the use of microcomputers to increase in schools, they should be used both for institutional and administrative purposes. So, now what do? We select schools in which microcomputers are used for both institutional and administrative purposes and see whether this is happening. We select schools where microcomputers are either used for administrative purposes or institutional purposes. So, that will help us test our initial set of propositions. So, it is not that we increase the breadth, but rather we increase the depth. So, replication logic is that which is followed by experiments, that you do not go to multiple million instances, but the same instance which you are repeating time and again under slightly different conditions, and you are trying to find out whether the causal linkage exists or not. So, the selection of case studies is very important, and if you look at this model or this diagram, this would tell you that the conduct of the first, second case studies, and then would come the writing of individual case reports and cross case conclusions. Cross case conclusions are definitely important. Why? Because you need to be able to compare the similarities and the differences between cases which you are researching on. Now, moving ahead, how do you get started with case studies? The starting of case studies is always based on a research question and the research constructs which come into focus. I have already discussed in multiple sessions in depth on what kind of research questions should you be framing and why should the research question not evince any researcher bias. It is very important for you that the central research questions of your study should be free from researcher bias. Though formulated, the research questions and constructs remain tentative until they find a grounding in the empirical findings. Now, one of the reasons why case studies is extremely popular in qualitative research is that it is one among the few research methods which help combine the principles and philosophies of deductive research and inductive research together. Now, I have explained deductive and inductive research very carefully and in detail in the videos and supplements that I had shared in the very first week. Now, if learners are interested to understand what are the differences between deductive and inductive, they can look at the video or look at the supplement as is possible for them. Now, if I am following a deductive stance, the idea is that I borrow a set of hypotheses from an overriding theory, and the sole purpose of research would be to generate support or not for the hypothesis proposed in a real time, real life context. Now, for inductive research, it is just the opposite, that empirical observations would give birth to theory or would help modify theory, but case studies are a method which would strike a balance between the two. So, you would have a theory from which you generate initial propositions and then you collect data to find out whether those propositions make any sense in the real world or not, and the empirical data would then help modify the initial theory or the initial propositions that you had proposed. Now, in the entire framework of case studies, it is very important to understand how you select case studies. Now, as I said, replication logic is what is followed in the selection of case studies, and replication, as I had discussed in the second session of the week, follows two different paths. One is literal replication, the other is theoretical replication. Now, in case studies, we do not go by the random sampling approach, but rather we follow a sampling method which is a part of purposive sampling called as theoretical sampling. In this video, I will not explain more on theoretical sampling because this has already been taken care of in qualitative sampling. So, learners, I would request you to please kindly refer back to week number 4 and qualitative sampling purposive methods. Theoretical sampling in the supplement has been described in detail for you. So, it is important that you need to understand all of this to come to a basic understanding of how to get started with case studies. Now, moving ahead, we craft instruments and protocols, and here there is a word that is called as triangulation. So, what is meaning of triangulation of data collection methods? The word triangulation means multiple. What is the meaning of multiple? So, when I am looking at data collection methods, it is important that you use more than one data collection method to verify your findings and also collect voluminous data. So, if I am using qualitative research interviews, it is highly advisable that I also use another data collection method called as participant observation. So, when you are looking at triangulation in data collection, triangulation in sampling methods, or triangulation in data analysis, you are basically talking about multiple avenues of analysis, multiple avenues of sampling methods, or multiple types of data collection methods. Now, herein case studies also bring another layer of complexity in the use of multiple investigators or researchers. So, why would you have multiple investigators or researchers? The first advantage is that they enhance the creative potential of the study. Why? Because multiple people will bring multiple thoughts, and that will allow for a better convergence so far as data is concerned. Second, the convergence of these diverse thoughts may enhance confidence in the findings. So, there is a question of inter-rater reliability in findings which can be very, very important for the overall reliability and validity of the results that you gather through case studies. Now, once you enter into the field, you will find that in qualitative research there is often an overlap between data collection and data analysis. In this week particularly, we are looking at two prime methods of called data analysis, one which is the grounded theory, the other which is the case study. Now, in grounded theory also I had explained that why data analysis and data collection happen simultaneously. Now, the reason being that when you are analyzing the initial data that you collect, it is very, very possible that you may get some instances from data that will allow you to change your track in data collection. So, certain amounts of coding, certain themes or certain patterns that allow or that emerge from data that will allow you to refine your questions, that will allow you to refine the selection of cases, and that will also give you the added advantage of collecting data which would advance your theory the best. So, that is the reason why in most of the popular qualitative data analytic methods, you would find an overlap between data collection and data analysis. Now, moving ahead, if you look at the analysis that you are doing within the case data is voluminous, it is huge, and it is very rich. That is the nature of the data that you collect. There is no written format to write the ultimate case report that you would be showing, but the case report is narrative in nature and it is interspersed with verbatim comments from the respondents. So, that will enhance the potential of the report and the credibility of the report also. Now, apart from looking at single cases, you are also collecting multiple case data. So, when you collect multiple case data, the idea is that you should be searching for cross case patterns. Otherwise, why would you collect multiple case data? Now, The first is you select categories or dimensions within the cases, and how would you do so? Now, for example, let us say you are looking at decision making which would have an impact, overall impact on firm performance. So, in the selection of category or dimensions, you may wish to divide your organizations by trust, by cooperative, by owner driven, by proprietor driven, or by public limited company. So, that is how you can also create different cases and understand the differences or similarities between these cases. Then you select pair of cases and list the similarities and differences between them. This is at the heart of cross case patterns. The idea of cross case patterns is that you notice similarities and, more very importantly, you notice differences between the cases, and you divide the data by the data source. This is also one way to do cross case analysis. And how would you divide the data by the data source? You would divide the cases, or you would divide the data by looking at information that you receive from the interviews, by looking at information that you receive from observations, by looking at information that you receive from focus group discussions, etc. Now, coming to the next, that is the shaping of hypothesis. Shaping of hypothesis is the sharpening, the whole idea is that you sharpen the constructs that you have used, and you must be able to maintain construct validity. Now, in the beginning also I had emphasized that construct validity is maintained by making sure that the operational definition of the construct would measure what the construct intends to measure. That is very important. You shape hypothesis by verifying the emergent relationships between the constructs, and you maintain the internal validity between the constructs. So, the idea is that if you are proposing an initial relationship between the constructs, then that relationship should be validated, that relationship should be accurately validated through the empirical data that you collect. But I think learners should not be very fascinated with the idea of collecting data only to validate the hypothesis that they posit or the propositions that they posit. If the empirical data is not able to validate the relationships, then actually it gives learners to come back with counterintuitive findings and to come back with findings that may give birth to or lead to further research, or will ask them to revisit the initial research questions that they had posited. Now comes the idea of enfolding literature. After you have collected the data, written the case analysis report, made cross case patterns, what should you be doing? Should you be getting over with the analysis, or should you be moving ahead? The idea is that after all the analysis is done, all the reports are generated, it is very important to revisit the results, keeping in mind the literature that you had already reviewed. So, what is the idea of enfolding literature or revisiting literature here? You need to understand whether your results have shown similarity with existing literature, or whether your results differ from existing literature, and if they differ, why? If they show similarities, why? Now, the idea is to come to a closure. What is the meaning of closure? That you start from initial set of literature, you build propositions, you ask research questions, you collect your data from cases, you write your case reports, come back to the literature again and close. So, that is the process of case analysis in a nutshell. But then if we want to understand this in greater detail, we will have to go back to Robert Ain and look at the small little book that he had written, which explains this completely. The full reference of the book will be provided to you in the supplement. Now, for every research method that you are undertaking, issues of reliability and validity are very important. So, here I have put down in a tabular format that how would you maintain construct validity, internal validity, external validity and reliability in a case study. So, construct validity can be maintained by using multiple sources of evidence. They can be primary, they can be secondary. You establish a chain of evidence, you have informants review the draft. I think this is the third point is very important, that when you are sharing your initial drafts, whether they are interview transcripts or results of participant observation with your key respondents or your key informants, they need to review and they need to say that yes, they agree to this draft or they can revise it. Now, the phase of research where you would maintain construct validity, that is data collection. Now internal validity, which is explaining the causal relationship. What do you do? How do you maintain this? You need to do pattern matching, within case, between case, explanation building, and even better is a longitudinal design. What is the meaning of a longitudinal design? A design which extends over in time. So you do not collect data from the same case at one point in time, but you collect data from the same case multiple points in time to understand whether the causal linkage exists or not. Then comes the idea of external validity or the ability to generalize. Now you can use replication logic to help build this, and of course reliability is the consistency of results whereby you may derive similar results under similar circumstances, and this also can be maintained through case study protocol and case study database, and the phase in which it is taken care of is the data collection. Now coming to the next, which is talking about the strengths and weaknesses of a case study. The biggest strength of the case study is the generation or the ability to generate theory that may be new. Constructs and hypotheses can be tested and verified, but at the same time some weaknesses also are there, that because the case study yields a lot of data, that can be a problem, and sometimes the researcher is lost in the data that they collect. That how do I make sense of this data? What do I write about this data? How do I still maintain reliability and validity? These are some of the common challenges that a researcher can face. But at the same time, I would say that case studies are the best known adjustments between deductive and inductive research. But at the same time, if the data analysis is not properly designed or not properly reported, you may either have a very diffuse theory which is extremely abstract, or you may have a very narrow and idiosyncratic theory which can have very less application. So in a nutshell, keeping in mind the time that we have for this video segment, this is what case studies are all about in qualitative data analysis. But I think to have a better picture of what all of this is, I have created a small supplement which learners can use, and even further, depending on the kind of interest and the time that you have, you can make use of the references that I provide in this supplement to augment your learning and interest. So once again, thank you for your time and attention, and we come back to you in week 8 once again with a summary and closure of the course. Thank you.